So you are very welcome to the Ask the Expert series. I'm Susan Rosney. I'm Sustainability Officer with Chartered Accountants Ireland. And every month I invite an expert to answer your questions on sustainability. Today, the topic is jargon. Sustainability is jargon heavy, filled with acronyms. Accountants are being tasked with measuring and reporting on sustainability issues, and they have to get up to speed quickly. And then they face this alphabet soup. I'm delighted that Rosie Dunscombe is joining me today. Rosie is Climate Change Technical Lead with the Institute of Chartered Accountants England and Wales and has many years' experience of both chartered accountancy and environmental economics, advising businesses, finance institutions, and civil society on sustainable business strategy. Rosie, you are very welcome.
Thank you, Susan.
Just to let everybody know, we're recording this session and everyone is welcome to ask questions as we go along, but I do already have some to begin with. And I'm going to start with the obvious question, which is, what is sustainability?
Well, I can start with, well, it's a good one to start with, and there is a definition, an official definition that came from the Brundtland report. It's essentially meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, that's lovely, but is it helpful? So I think it's probably relevant to give a little bit of context in the brief time we have. And today we're facing what we talk about as the triple crisis in sustainability. So climate change, which we're all aware of, biodiversity loss, which is increasing in prominence and awareness, and social inequality and broader social issues. And we've seen that uprising with Black Lives Matters and the real awareness of inequality during the COVID pandemic. And those are sort of nice three areas to think about when we think about sustainability. And I'd also point people towards the Sustainable Development Goals that look to set goals to tackle those issues, because that official definition is nice, but not always useful.
I think I get the impression anyway that it had to be encapsulated somehow because it's so broad. So when it's boiled down to its essentials, it's meeting your needs without compromising future generations. So when you mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, that's an international standard?
Yes, it's essentially a set of 17 goals that there's a wonderful diagram, it's called the wedding cake diagram, that I would point people to. You can Google that. And it sets out sustainable goals over three levels. So it talks about the environmental level, which is the foundation really, which helps to support social goals, which ultimately feeds into the economy. So it really shows how the environment and society are all the foundations on which the economy is built.
And funny, when you mention environment and society, I think, okay, there's the E and the S. So that brings me on to the question I have, which is this term ESG. This is a term which is being used more and more. And I certainly, well, I'd see it almost every day. And I know what it means. But would you mind explaining exactly what ESG is? And is it different to EESG?
Yeah, so I could spend the whole webinar on this, but I won't. It's actually a really thorny topic when you dig into it, but it's environmental, social, and governance is what ESG stands for. And at its very basic, you're talking about, for example, assessing a company's exposure to sustainability issues. So you look across these three pillars of environment and social, and then the governance pillar could be looked at as how you're tackling those issues. So how are you applying good corporate governance, tackling with corruption and other governance issues in order to meet your goals or tackle risks associated with environment and society. It is a bit different to sustainability, and if you were sort of a hardline technical person, you could say that they're totally different things. And sustainability comes with it. We talked about that, meeting the needs of the present without compromising future generations. And so we have this concept of what is known as planetary boundaries. We all know, I think we probably all heard, or we're living off the resources of 3 planets, and that's not sustainable. So the theory behind sustainability is we need to live within our planetary boundaries, and we need to live above the social foundation. So meet those environmental goals without compromising those who are disadvantaged. And that is really the fundamental pretext behind sustainability. ESG in practice tends to be more about key performance indicators and processes. It doesn't really have that planetary boundary social foundation at its heart. It's really come from the corporate and the finance sector.
Which is possibly why we're hearing about it so much from the perspective of chartered accountants and from finance professionals, because this is how a finance professional is going to interpret sustainability. It's through this lens of ESG. And when I heard the term EESG, that was economic, environmental, social, and governance. But obviously, if you're in a financial role, the economic is dropped, because that's taken for granted. It is a business. You're looking at the finances of it. Therefore, the economics is taken for granted. So then you are making decisions based on, taking into account your impact on the environment, your impact on society, and to make sure that you're meeting various governance metrics, be it anti-corruption, be it. So I think when I was looking at it first, I was seeing it as environmental and social as two kind of pillars with governance wrapping around it. But is that the way it's working as well?
Do you know, and the first thing I'd say is there isn't a rule book on ESG. And this is why we're having this conversation, right? Because there's huge confusion and it's something that's just evolved. And so there isn't a framework, a single overriding framework for ESG that we can refer to. And that makes it a very complex area. And I think that, yes, originally, actually, the G was really there to wrap around the E and the S to say, well, how, I see it as the slightly more boring part. How are your corporate controls in place? Do you have an ESG committee? What's your process and control document? Are you implementing all that properly? Boring, but critical if you're going to implement those things. But actually, over time, G has become, the governance part has started to stand on its own a bit more with, with things like cybercrime and, economic fraud, corruption, really coming up the agenda in terms of risks to business. And so it started to stand on its own a little bit more, which is great, but can be confusing.
And you mentioned risk. So one thing we do hear a lot about is climate risk, because it's, I don't know, can you say it's more quantifiable, but it's certainly in the news a lot more. We know that the IPCC published its 2 reports, most recently in February. The one before that was August, and there's another one due out next week. So would you mind just talking about, when people see IPCC, what does that mean and how it pertains to them as finance professionals?
Sure. So
if it does at all.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So these are the science bods. These are the people who are looking at what are the readings in the atmosphere, what's happening in respect of climate change on the planet, how are our emissions connected to that, how should we be managing it, what kind of targets should we be looking at to limit the worst ramifications of climate change. So we need to tackle the climate crisis and all crises collaboratively. We as accountants shouldn't know it all because we are accountants, but we need the help from the scientists to say, this is what's happening, these are the risks, and these are the goals we need to work towards. And that's what the IPCC report does. It looks at, it's an assessment report that assesses the impacts of climate change. And so it's looking really at also at ecosystems and biodiversity and communities, so across this whole E and S pillars, and what should the response be at global and regional levels. And I think the most recent report, what is, I suppose, most worrying is that they talk about a 1.5 degree target and they have all these emissions, but the maths isn't quite adding up for the scientists. I think the climate change they are seeing is more rapid than they had anticipated, and that is concerning. And I mean, we don't know everything about our planet, the biome, ecosystems, how it all functions. And so that's interesting. And it's really important to be grounded in that science. But I mean, the reports can be slightly mind-boggling.
They certainly can. And I've only ever tried to read the executive summaries of those. And even those are kind of mind-boggling as well. But ultimately, we have the message that the climate risks are enormous. So the TCFD is something that to me seems like a tool where people can address climate change, but they also interpret the risk that climate change is having on their business. And this leads me into the point of acronyms, that there's so many acronyms in this space. So if a finance professional accountant is tasked with looking at the risks to their business from climate change, that are posed by climate change, the TCFD is something that they might be pointed to. Could you talk about just what the TCFD is and how it is useful for businesses?
So it's the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So this came about several years ago, and it really aimed to bring climate change to the finance community, to the business community, and it's in its essence, it's a strategic risk management framework. Now, if people have heard of it, they've probably heard about it as a disclosure framework because it sets certain disclosure requirements out, and it has been regulated in the UK and in a couple of other countries, and it's really gaining traction. And I think that's because it was really designed to speak to the investor community. So who are the users of annual reports? What do they want and need to see to manage their risks? And that's what this TCFD piece of legislation and framework is seeking to do. And at the moment, it's capturing large companies in the UK from next month, actually, April 2022, they will need to report against it. And yes, I haven't got that long to chat about it, but it's about looking at potential future scenarios. So are we looking at a 1.5 degree scenario or a 3 degree scenario? What does that mean for my business? Am I resilient and adaptable to it? So that's why I say it's really a risk management framework that ends in disclosure. And then you disclose that in the front half of your annual report to your stakeholders.
So it's a way of quantifying it, of really kind of knitting together the financial, because it's climate related financial disclosures. This isn't.
Yeah, and it can be qualitative. And I think what they've tried to do, they tried to be pragmatic with this, because actually the number of people lying around who've got 5 years experience doing TCFD disclosures, they just aren't around. And so they were concerned with the business ability to actually implement this. So they have tried to be kind, but also it's pretty rapid, the rate at which it's coming through. And one thing to note for people joining today is you might be sitting there saying, I'm a small or medium enterprise, I'm not captured by this, it's not relevant for me. We are seeing it bite through supply chains. So if you're supplying a large organization, they're needing to report on their risks, they're going to start demanding information from you. So it is something to be aware of from that regard. And also it is at a high level quite a useful process for assessing risk.
I've heard that with many of the frameworks as well, that it's a useful exercise regardless of what the end result needs to be, regardless of whether you're being asked for this from investors or whether you're being mandated to do it. It's still a very useful activity. And on the subject of managing risk and governance, I have just a message from one of my own colleagues, Neil Fitzgerald, who has written, P.S. governance is not boring, because Neil is head of ethics and governance. And he asked—
Sorry, Neil, I didn't mean to offend.
He's wounded. Would you touch on COP and the various types of COP meetings? Why we hear so much about COP? And this is a good question, actually. Why do we hear so much about COP26 and not others?
Well, maybe
what
the
COP
European
is,
So COP is Conference of Parties, and at a high level, it refers to a conference of parties to an international treaty. So it could actually be any treaty. We tend to talk about it in relation to climate change because I think those meetings are so prominent. You know, Obama attends and Biden flies in, and we see all these big names. And obviously COP26 was held in Glasgow, so quite close to home for people in the UK. And I mean, that's why we heard so much about that. And also I think just the broader picture of what's going on, climate change is really high on people's mind. And I think we were concerned when the pandemic happened, those of us who work in this field, that we might lose some traction in sustainability. But actually, I think it highlighted it even more in people's minds. And I think that's why we heard about this COP26. So that was the meeting of all the parties. There are about 190 states signed up to this international treaty on climate change to say, we are going to take best efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And that 1.5 degrees has come from an IPCC report who said we should be aiming for 1.5 degrees if we want to avoid the worst impacts. I think with Greta Thunberg and other people like that coming forward, we're aware that we're not on track to meet 1.5 degrees. It is worrying, and it's very complex, this negotiating process, when you have the big sort of Western economies and then you have the smaller economies from generally the global South saying, you know, actually, it's all right for you, you're extracting your oil and gas from our country, so your GHG emissions don't look so bad, but you're impacting on us, there should be damage and reparation, which might be. So there's all these kind of complexities around who should be paying for the decarbonisation, where should it be happening, and how are we going to reach those targets? And that's what those meetings are trying to do. They're trying to iron out who's responsible for what and how we're going to meet the agreement in that international treaty.
And I see that that responsibility is coming into the business world as well. That take an oil company, for instance, a barrel of oil is 80% of the emissions for that one barrel of oil are not in the drilling of it. It's actually in the use of it by us, burning it to heat our homes, power our cars, etc. So companies themselves are looking at their supply chains and their value chains to when they're counting their own carbon emissions. So that leads into the scope 1 emissions, which is the fossil fuels you burn, and those are the emissions you're directly generating. Scope 2 is when you're using electricity, which is itself burning fossil fuels to generate the electricity. And then scope 3 is what we're talking about there, is where you're responsible for somebody emitting.
Yes, and that scope 3 is really risen in prominence lately. And I think that, there's another acronym, SBTI, the Science Based Target Initiative, which is encouraging organisations to set, and this is what you said, the corporates getting involved, they should set targets to reach net zero emissions, and those should be science-based. And to be science-based, if you have a certain portion of your emissions in your scope 3, so outside of your direct operations, but you've got huge emissions perhaps in the materials you're purchasing or in your consumer use, then you need to be including a target on that. And that is tricky. How do you get people to stop driving cars or to, stop using your kettle to boil water in an inefficient manner? I mean, it's tricky, but we all need to come together and collaborate, otherwise we're not going to hit those targets. And that's where we've seen this proliferation of companies saying we're going to be net zero by 2030 or 2040 or 2050. And the 1.5 degree target, the global net zero, is to be net zero by 2050 with the proviso that actually we need to decarbonize by half by 2030. We can't just rush in at the last minute. And corporates are being encouraged to do likewise, to set interim goals and to meet that target. And do say it's the most fashionable thing a CEO can do now, is to set a net zero target.
Yes, and actually I've just seen a question coming in there. Is scope 3 going to be where the real accountability is in all of this? And
the accountability over scope 3 is tricky because you may have overlap, and it's having been involved in scope 3 assessments, it's a complex area. And I think skills that accountants bring and accountants have are going to be critical in this, because you're looking at, it's all about data. Where are your emissions coming from? What product are they associated with? What geography are they associated with? Where can I have an impact? Where do I have control? Where do I have influence? Where do I not? How can I get influence? What can I do? And it really is down to let's drill down into the data and data analytics. And that's something that a lot of accountants are really skilled at.
Absolutely. And then they're also skilled at the reporting element as well. So how do you gather that data and interrogate it and then disclose it? And while we're talking about disclosure, then and you mentioned the acronym of SBTI, I was going to ask you about the reporting, but actually before I do that, net zero, that term, this bedeviled me last year when I was doing the climate essentials for accountants. What is the difference between net zero and carbon neutral?
Oh, yes. Well, the fundamental theory underpinning a net zero target is the mitigation hierarchy. And what that means is you need to eliminate your emissions, then look to reduce them where you can, then look to, I can't remember the exact terminology, but maybe change products, change inputs, adapt in some way to reduce your emissions further before you compensate for emissions that are still there. So saying really, you need to be getting rid of all your emissions. You don't just want to be buying offsets. So people might have heard of offsets. This is where I'm still emitting, millions of tons of carbon, but it's okay because I'm buying tree planting projects in America, which is going to offset my emissions. Now, if we wanted to offset all the global emissions that we have today, we'd need something like 7 times the size of India to plant forest. Now, bear in mind that a lot of non-urban landscape is needed for agriculture. It's just not feasible.
Mm.
And that's where carbon neutral really gets a bashing in the press, because it is people not reducing their emissions. It's I'm just going to offset, so I'm carbon neutral. Actually, what we really need is people reducing their emissions. And you know, there's where technology comes in, and innovation, and looking at, I think, the role of accountants, if you're looking at forecasting or assessing new product lines or new areas of the business, needs to be assessing, how does that impact my carbon footprint? What does that mean for our net zero goal?
Yeah. So, okay. So basically net zero is when you're aggressively reducing, and then
they
adapting.
Talk about, yeah. And you should only be offsetting the residual emissions. Okay. And for if you're following a science-based target, I can't remember the exact percentage, but it's something like you can only have 10% residual emissions that you can offset. And don't quote me, I can't remember the exact number. But for carbon neutral, you're not following science-based targets, you're just offsetting your emissions.
Okay, so it doesn't matter how much you're pumping into the atmosphere. You feel, as long as I'm going to be pulling out a bit, or not even pulling out a bit, but just kind of doing a conscious salve. Okay, so that I have it now. Thank you very much. I'll update the publication. But a question here is actually, will accountants have to work with other professionals to measure and analyze carbon? And the professionals there can suggest are engineers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is all about collaboration across expertise, areas of expertise. I don't think any accountant should be expected to do this on their own. And I think that in kind of the training that I've been working on and looking at, it's about giving accountants almost enough knowledge to be dangerous, enough knowledge to go and ask the questions, to find the right expert. And yes, it may well be engineers, depending on your industry, whoever's responsible for those products or the data around those emissions, to say, you know, how could we engineer this differently to reduce emissions? And I know that the Chartered Institute of Engineers, Civilness, it's all sorts of different engineers, aren't they, mechanical and civil, but they are looking at this net zero issue as well, and how they can tackle it and upskill their engineers.
And I saw last year, actually, I think ICAEW was one of the signatories of a charter of professionals who are going to work together for climate change, or to take action on climate change. Is that what that's meant as well, that everyone has to collaborate? And goal 17 of the UN SDGs that you mentioned earlier is collaboration for the goal. So nobody can do this in isolation, but everybody has this role to play. But I can't leave before I ask you about reporting, because reporting seems to be another great source of acronyms. And it leads me to think of a comment that you made earlier, actually, on LinkedIn, which I saw in response to my colleague Neil, about acronyms they always occur in areas which are young and growing. And is that why we see so many acronyms in this? And could you talk about just the ISSB, what that means and where that's come from?
Of course, yes. So I thought this question might come up, so I had to get a diagram because it's so complicated, this area. So the ISSB is the International Sustainability Standards Board that came into being on the 1st of February this year. It's housed under IFRS. So the International Financial Reporting Standards Body has under it the IASB, the International Accounting Standards Board, and now the International Sustainability Standards Board. So the aim is that we can get a sort of globally accepted group of sustainability standards, similar to what we have under IASB. So, for example, the US say, we don't want to adopt your standards, we're going to have our own, that's fine. But hopefully get a critical mass of people adopting the same standard to try and harmonize this alphabet soup. And what is really encouraging about the ISSB is they are trying to build on the work that's already been done. And so I think we talked about that there's this group of 5 kind of reporting standards, frameworks, guidance that has been out there for many years, that includes, SASB, CDSB, GRI, Integrated Reporting Council. There's all these acronyms, and essentially, SASB was kind of the American counterpart, CDSB was in Europe, GRI has actually stepped to one side now, that's the Global Reporting Initiative. So there are all these organizations that have actually been subsumed into the ISSB. So hopefully in 12 months' time we can forget about all the old acronyms, those 5 old ones and concentrate really on the ISSB. But this all started with a paper released, a document a few years ago with an intention to work together towards this reporting body. And they, at the moment, they have 2 draft standards that I'm on the working group there, and we've had sight of those, and they're going to be releasing them for public consultation any day now, actually. And so they're working hard to kind of try and standardize and harmonize this area of reporting.
I think I saw it tomorrow. I think I saw it's
meant to be by the end of the month.
Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah, they're screeching in there on the 31st. Yeah. It certainly seems to have happened very fast, because I imagine the IFRS standards did not come together as quickly as 12 months or so that the ISSB has allowed itself pull this together.
Well, yes, and I think there is an awful lot of work going on. I know people are working very hard, but also to remember that they're building on existing, they're not starting with a blank piece of paper. They really have taken, for example, the CDSB, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, they already had a framework with sort of 5 different areas to it, and they've taken that and said, right, we're going to build on that. So that's fantastic, because it's not something brand new and shouldn't be unfamiliar to people who have been using those standards to date.
So I'm going to take this as a positive message, because very often when I finish doing an event on sustainability, I think people can slink away going, oh my God, there's just so much awful stuff to worry about. But I think this is really good. There's collaboration, there is harmonization happening, it's happening fast. And just finally, I got a question in asking, what resources do the Institute, this is our Institute, have in this area? And I've put some content in the chat that everyone has access to there. The first one is the Climate Essentials for Accountants. There's a glossary there of all the sustainability terms. And also then there's a link to resources from the Institute that we have for sustainability generally. Apologies for going over time. I just couldn't resist when I had Rosie here to ask her so many questions, but thank you so much for joining us. That was extremely useful. And I've loads of other questions that I'll just have to ask you offline, and you're on our working group obviously, so I will have an opportunity hopefully to put those to you in the future at some point. But on behalf of us in Chartered Accountants Ireland, I just want to thank you so much again for joining us. It's been great to get your expertise on this topic.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I think one key message is that collaboration, that I don't have all the answers, I have a certain area of expertise, and I need we all need to work with experts from other industries. So it's fantastic to be here. Thank you, Susan.
Okay. Well, thanks again, and thanks to everybody who has joined us. And we'll take care, and we'll see you for the next Ask the Expert session that we have. All the best now. Bye.